momentary sigh of relief. I mean, think about this president. He's been in charge now for the entire war, and he's given us a hint of what he thinks Reconstruction should look like. The state of Louisiana had designed its own Reconstruction, and he's pleased with it. You know, he's pleased with this question. So he gives a speech. John Wilkes Booth is there. And in it, he says, hey, you know, these colored men, was the phrase then, should not be deprived to the elective franchise, the right to vote. And and even Lincoln here supports that. So the 13th Amendment has been ratified, okay, by these states. So he and his wife, and I haven't talked about Mary Lincoln, but Mary Lincoln had a tough time being first lady. She suffered from clinical depression, and the death of their child one of their boys, while she was first lady, was very, very disheartening. And one of their outlets was to go to the theater, go to performances of live, theatrical performances. And Lincoln did not get to go very much, as you might imagine. The theater was sort of hard to do during the war, but he did go some. And they had what was called here, just not far from the White House, at what's called Ford's Theater. They had the presidential box, the place where the president and the first lady sat. So the president's wife, the first lady, invited General Grant and his wife to go with President Lincoln to see a very famous performer. Her name was Laura Keene. You see it here. Laura Keene, and they were British, in a play called Our American Cousin. And this was a big hit. This was like a well-known theatrical performance. So Lincoln was tickled. He was like, yeah, finally. And so he put on white kid gloves, which he hated. He had huge hands, and his butler sat him out and said, you have to wear them, to the show. Your wife, the missus, will get angry. And so he gets all dressed up and he goes to the theater. Now, in the meantime, there has been, even before Appomattox, a conspiracy afoot. A conspiracy is when more than one person acts. So when someone doesn't act alone. Now, history will associate this event with John Wilkes Booth, as it should. But he's really a part of a larger conspiracy. For months now, a group of people have been meeting in a boarding house in Washington. That's like a kind of like a bed and breakfast, run by a lady named Mary Surratt, and her son and others have been planning a coup d'etat, an overthrow of the government. They want to capture Abraham Lincoln, capture Andrew Johnson, and capture U.S. Grant, okay, and capture William Seward, the Secretary of State. So if they get all of these guys, then they're going to keep the war going. John Wilkes Booth is a Maryland actor who was a huge celebrity. I was reading somewhere and discovered this fellow was like the Brad Pitt of his day. He was an actor and a very popular stage actor. In fact, one of the things I read said that he was the second most recognizable face in America behind Lincoln, which is extraordinary, but nonetheless, he was like a superstar.
That's like
Brad Pitt killing the president, right? Yeah, exactly. Like, this was a famous guy, not just some random dude. And he was a devout Southern Confederacy supporter, even though he was in Maryland. Okay, and so he believes, particularly, I told you he was in the crowd when this speech was given, and he believes that Lincoln is going to impose black rule on the Southerners, and that can't happen. And so he shifts their gears away from capturing and kidnapping the leaders to killing them. Okay, so they're going to attempt to assassinate all four of these leaders: the leader of the State Department, the military, the president, and the vice president. Okay, so the night of the assassination, Booth was a regular actor at Ford's Theater, so he could get access into and around backstage without anybody blinking an eye. So that made him the natural choice for this. One of his co-conspirators would also go to where Andrew Johnson was staying, the vice president's hotel, shoot him. And another would go to William Seward's house and shoot him, right? So, and Booth would get Grant and Lincoln because they would be together, right? The word had gotten out. Well, Grant, for whatever reason, he and his wife choose to not go to the theater that night. They choose to take a train. They'd already planned to go back, like to visit friends out of town. And so Lincoln's wife, Mary Lincoln, invites a captain, I think he's a captain, and his young wife to join him. So you'll see in the picture here, a military personnel and a younger woman, right? So here's the first lady, the president, the captain, and I forget her name, but major. He was a major, not a captain. I'm sorry. So Booth had already drilled a small hole in the back of the door of Lincoln's box, and he comes up to the doorway, and he looks in, and he has a dagger and a pistol, right? And he sees that Grant's not there, but he's going to go forward with it anyway. He slips in during the performance. People are hearing the performance, and Lincoln and others have been laughing. It's kind of a comedy. And he sticks the gun right to the back of Lincoln's head. All right. I apologize. I didn't catch that. I wasn't showing that. Jeez. Sorry.
Didn't he create the Secret Service before he went to the theater?
Well, the thing that's interesting about the phrase Secret Service is that it didn't really exist in what we would consider the modern incarnation. He had a bodyguards, but they were not the Secret Service, not our current. Now he did use like military bodyguards usually when he traveled, okay, but not the contemporary Secret Service. So here's Ford's Theater again. I apologize, and this was Good Friday, so this is Easter weekend. Okay, the war has only been over for 5 days, right? So this is like Lincoln finally being able to breathe easy. Okay, and Booth, here he is, the celebrity actor. He slips behind the door, and it's dark, and he sticks the revolver to the back of Lincoln's head, like more or less. And when he fires, the bullet goes through Lincoln's skull and lodges behind his eye, but it doesn't kill him instantly. So this is a severe head wound. Booth will jump off of this balcony. You can go to Ford's Theater now. The balcony's still there, and it's a big drop. His heel gets caught in the bunting, which is like the red, white, and blue stuff. And when he lands awkwardly and breaks his ankle. But nonetheless, he hobbles out and he yells. Well, there's a debate, but the consensus seems to be he yells the motto of Virginia, "Sic semper tyrannis," which in Latin, "and thus to tyrants," right? So he's killed Lincoln, he says, "thus to tyrants," and he hobbles out. There is a waiting horse. A guy is helping. He has a horse ready for him. He hops on the horse and rides off into the countryside. The guy who was supposed to kill Johnson, Andrew Johnson, gets drunk. He's trying to drink himself courage, to go through with it. He goes to the hotel. He's reported there, after the fact. And then he doesn't do anything. He just leaves. He got chickens out, you might say. The guy who goes to kill Seward, the Secretary of State, goes right up to his house, knocks on the door. He's received by Seward's son. Now, this is where history is very funny, how history works out. Seward, earlier in the month, like a week before, had been thrown off a horse. Not uncommon. So he'd been thrown from a horse and broke his neck. And so he was confined to his bed. Well, he had a wooden neck brace. If you've ever had like whiplash or something, you see people with these neck braces that are like plastic now. Well, they didn't have that then. So it was wooden. And it like fit over and plaster on his chest to kind of hold it there. So Seward's son is like, the secretary's not seeing anyone right now. He's not well. And Touart says, "I have to deliver this message. It's urgent." And the guy's like, "Well, you can give it to me, his son, and I'll take it." And so at this point, the assassin pushes past the son, rushes up the stairs towards the bedroom, looking for him. He bursts in, and there's Seward laying in bed, right? And he then starts stabbing him, just right in the, right around this area, right around the neck and chest. And his son, Seward's son, rushes up and tackles the guy, right? Well, Seward's not harmed. He's unharmed. It's only like scratches because this neck brace is solid wood, the knife like bounces off of it like Kevlar, you know, and so Seward survives. Grant, not even harmed at all. Johnson, so the only casualty of this coup d'etat is President Lincoln, tragically. Lincoln will be carried across the street and laid in a bed. Now, Lincoln was over 6'3", very tall man, and they had to lay him diagonally in the bed. He was so long his feet would lay off the end of it. Beds were shorter back then. And he lives through the night for a period of time. As Mrs. Lincoln comes, the cabinet comes, there are soldiers everywhere, and then by the morning, and this is right before Easter Sunday, he passes away. He dies, and the great emancipator is dead. Well, Stanton will give a quote. He'll say, "And now he is one for the ages." They knew immediately Lincoln would be the greatest president, or one of the greatest of all time. All right, and it was such a tragic end. Booth had thought his actions would help the South. This would be a terrible mistake. His actions, the assassination, are going to make life much worse for the South, because the people who take over, right, are truly radical. They're far more radical than President Lincoln was. And their objective, their dream, is to punish the South. Lincoln was trying to heal the wounds and bring the South back into the Union. The men in charge of the Congress now are going to want to punish the South. And tragically, Andrew Johnson is no Abraham Lincoln, not by a long shot. He'll be a terrible letdown. So there is a manhunt throughout the region, and Booth is seen in a barn. He is shot in the back, and the barn catches on fire, and he and one of the conspirators die in that engagement. Booth dies, in a gunfight. But the rest of the conspirators are found, and they are arrested. And you have an actual interesting post story here. One of the conspirators is the lady who, it was her house. And she will adamantly refuse to admit that she had anything to do with it. In other words, she says, what my son and his friends were doing, I had no idea. And a military lawyer will defend her very well. He'll say that she was just an unwitting accomplice. Like, it was her house, but she didn't know what was going on. She'll be executed. The first woman executed by the federal government. So you see her hanging there. You can see her dress in this picture. So they execute everyone that was involved with the conspiracy, who had planned it, including the guy who got drunk and everybody else. And America, is, because you look at the amount of reward for these people, it's $100,000. That's an extraordinary sum, right? But immediately, the questions become, what will be the fate of the South? So before we finish up for the day, I want you to look back. There's Stanton. This is Stanton standing here. It was not sort of, pictures like this are completely fabricated. Not like everybody was sitting around stoically while President Lincoln was dying, but rather what happens is artists would draw the faces of all the people that were there onto a sort of milieu, all combined in one spot. Gideon Welles, yeah, this is the Secretary of the Navy. These guys had, and then here's Stanton, right? Yeah, I don't think that's how it looked, but nonetheless, now he belongs to the age. So when you think about the consequences of the Civil War, it is almost impossible to put into perspective deaths of such young people in such a dramatic fashion. Now, folks, we have had the deaths of tens of thousands of people in the world today, and it really has, I think, driven home an idea in my mind that people in this country are cynical about human life. We talk about life, but people were very comfortable, going right back to business with an epidemic. But this death was completely different in the sense that you couldn't fight it, the pandemic, so much, right? Like, this was a war self-inflicted. 600,000. Now, by the way, most of those people did die from disease. Ironically, this was a disease, a battle of bacteria more than bullets in some respects. But 600 and almost 20,000 Americans, and some of the numbers are going higher in recent studies. So what you had happen a lot, when you go back and look at Civil War camps, there would be 30,000 people in a field living for 2 to 3 weeks. So you guys are probably too young to have ever been to like music festivals where you camp in fields, but pretty quickly they get really filthy. So they didn't have porta potties. They didn't have running water. So they had latrines that were ditches that were dug and set on fire and stuff, but it was human waste, human illness. So, and camps of soldiers throughout history are where most diseases have really been noted. The Spanish flu of 1918, you guys heard of the Spanish flu, the one that killed 20 million people, started in the military camps of the United States in Kansas and was brought to Europe from here because they would get typhus, which is a waterborne disease. They would get cholera. But when I say disease, bacteria in general from just cuts that went untreated, they would develop sepsis, blood poisoning. The healthcare was utterly rudimentary. So that's why the role of the U.S. Sanitary Commission was so important. I don't know if you remember Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, but they tried to combat this. And keep in mind, this is really before Pasteur's feces had gotten popularized, right? So they're using filthy materials and machine, like saws and things like that. So lots of outbreaks of scarlet fever. One of the most common was dysentery. Dysentery was very common, dehydration and all the problems. But keep in mind, they're fighting in August, right? In the heart of Virginia, and I walked around with like shorts on in Richmond in Virginia in August and thought, so I can't imagine wearing a wool uniform with 100 pounds of gear, so to speak, or 75 pounds. So it's really terrible. So let's take a look at, besides casualties, and keep in mind, the word casualties means wounded or killed, right? When you start to look at the total casualties, it is extraordinarily high, right? But again, overwhelmingly, probably 80% of all the deaths of the Civil War were due to disease. So that's 600 plus thousand. It's like over 400,000 were exposed to camp diseases, particularly scarlet fever, stuff like that. But to put in more perspective, the Civil War has had more deaths than all other American wars combined. So think about that. I mean, that's just a extraordinarily awful thing. Like this many Americans killed this many Americans. And of course it makes sense. We weren't fighting the Japanese or the Germans or the Brits. We were fighting each other, right? And so the only casualty virtually would be Americans. Let's take a look at the consequences. So over 1 million dead and wounded. So you're going to have a generation of amputees, a generation of people who are battle scarred, post-traumatic stress. There is a story in some movie I watched that I think I looked up was true. A soldier and two guys in a northern town, I think it was like Akron or something like that, both had their legs blown off. But one had their right leg off and one had their left. And so they would meet every year to buy shoes together because they had the same size feet. How terrible is that, right? The enormous monetary cost, $15 billion. We would be paying Civil War veteran pensions well up into the 20th century because they're spouses. So you would have actually young women like your age marrying 70-year-old veterans so they would get their pensions. They would keep getting their pensions as long as they were alive, as long as the spouse was alive. The great question of the supremacy of the federal government would be laid to rest. We've had tests of it since then, but no major challenge. In other words, once and for all, we are one nation. A test, as Lincoln said, of whether or not a nation founded on such principles could long endure. A nation founded on equality. Liberals around the globe were inspired to demand better progress because of the success as they viewed it. Now, I don't know if I would always call Lincoln a liberal, but the end of slavery and the expansion of government aid for people is perceived as liberal. You have I believe, a really terrible outcome that we're still dealing with here in the South. I was going to ask if any of you guys saw the paper this weekend. Richmond is putting up wall barricades around General Lee's statue before they take it down. They're afraid there'll be violence. So this debate, I'll show you guys soon about the statue legacy and how that's not really an immediate much after the Civil War, but it's really much more of a during the Civil Rights era, issue. But nonetheless, the idea that the South, was completely justified, and the only reason that the Southerners lost was because the North had industry. If it hadn't been for the industry, then the Southern system would have prevailed. It wasn't about slavery, you'll hear defenders say, which again, I believe is factually just incorrect, after having studied this my whole life. Slavery would be abolished. You had the 13th Amendment. And of course, people look at the Emancipation Proclamation, but really it was the 13th Amendment that made such a huge step, because it said once and for all, it would be written out of our Constitution. The Emancipation Proclamation could be reversed, executive order. The last 2 days, Joe Biden has issued something like 30 executive orders reversing President Trump's executive orders. But the 13th Amendment is the Constitution, and that's not going to change, really. This issue of being a truly united nation, I'd like you to remember the quote that goes basically, before the Civil War, the description of our country is these United States are, which means it's a plural. Like our country is like a collection of plural. After the war, it's the United States is, we are one nation. And that to me is the most important thing to recognize about the future of our country, is that after the Civil War, it will take a very long time to actually prove that. In other words, we're not truly united after the war, but we are one nation governmentally. But we have been healing from the Civil War ever since. And we continue to fight the battles of the Civil War now. I feel like they're the last ditch vestiges, the holdouts of a bygone era. But people have a hard time giving up things they love or refuse to give up. So that idea of the Confederacy will linger on as this sort of entity of chivalry and honor, and until it's refuted. Well, I love being an American. I love being a United States citizen. I do believe that I was blessed by being born in this country. But we have faced grave tests. So if you wake up one morning and you think, well, it's all gloom and doom from here on out, just imagine that, what must have people felt during the Civil War? What must have people felt during the Depression and World War II, right? Like, this has got to be it. And so I do believe that the best days of America are ahead of us. I really believe, if I didn't believe that, I would be all in it for myself. Just let's get greedy and get money, and who cares about the future, So in closing, before I have to call it a day, I would be just terribly remiss if I didn't give the great comparison, the bizarro comparison of Lincoln and Kennedy. So you've probably looked this up before, but it is one of the, American history is bizarre. There are events that occur that you would never have scripted. Jefferson and Adams dying on the 4th of July, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Who would have thunk it, right? Well, when you start reading the similarities between the death of Lincoln and the death of Kennedy, or their lives, it is eerie, and just a few of them, right? They both had 7 letters in their last name. They were both the second child in their family, both married in their 30s, both went to the House in a year ending in 46, right? Both weren't nominated for VP in the year 56. Both won in the year ending 60. It's creepy, right? Then you start really digging in. But I always think it's fascinating that one of the most interesting things, like Lincoln was shot in Ford's Theater and Kennedy was shot in a Lincoln, which is made by Ford. All right. So it's like the Simpsons getting it right, Both of them were concerned about being assassinated and expected it would happen, The great line about the Booth was shot in a theater and captured in a warehouse. It's more like a storehouse, right? And Oswald shot Kennedy from a warehouse and was captured in a theater. Yeah. So it's really fascinating. So anyway, I don't know why this is, but take a look at it and read it and just think, wow, are those all coincidences? It seems like divine providence.